In 1966, the night of the Grizzly gave Clint Walker a quiet ranch and a killer bear. The cast around him carried far stranger stories. 12 are gone now, from a Pennsylvania churchyard to a columbarium in Hollywood. One was pronounced dead by 2 doctors, then lived for decades. We open this countdown with the one man here who died and came back. A ski pole punched through Clint Walker's heart on a mountain in 1971, and 2 doctors examined him and pronounced him gone. He drifted, by his own account, into a calm and painless place and felt no real pull to return. A 3rd doctor, passing through, caught a flicker of life, rushed him into surgery and stitched the heart back together. Within 2 months, he was working again. On screen, he was Jim Cole, the 6'6" former lawman who traded his badge for a Wyoming ranch. The size was real, and so was the stillness. Before any of it, he had been a factory hand and a riverboat worker who joined the Merchant Marine at 17, then guarded the door at a Las Vegas hotel before an agent renamed him, and the Western series Cheyenne carried him to fame. His life ran in long chapters. He married Verna Garver in 1948, and their daughter Valerie grew up to become one of the first female airline pilots. Giselle Hennessy became his second wife in 1974, and he stayed with her until she died in 1994. His final marriage to Susan Cavallari in 1997 held until the very end. Walker died of congestive heart failure in Grass Valley, California, on the 21st of May 2018, 9 days short of 91. He was cremated, and his ashes stayed with Susan, the wife who had been beside him for the final 21 years. The man who wrestled a grizzly on screen had already won the only fight nobody wins. He died on a doctor's table at 43 and walked out to live almost half a century more. Second on the call sheet is a woman who heard the cruelest blow of her life come over the radio, in the voice of a man she had worked beside for 9 years. In 1984, Nancy Culp ran for Congress in Pennsylvania as a Democrat, and her former co-star Buddy Ebsen recorded an advertisement for her Republican opponent, telling voters he loved her dearly, but she was simply too liberal for him. She lost with roughly a third of the vote and called the ad rotten, saying the man behind it was nothing like the kindly character he had played. Here she was, the man-chasing storekeeper, dry and precise, the small part that hinted at the famous secretary to come. Long before Hollywood, she had earned a journalism degree, interviewed Clark Gable as a reporter, and served as a naval officer in the waves during the war. Plucked from an MGM publicity desk by the director George Cukor, she had drifted into acting almost by accident. She married Charles Dacus in 1951, divorced him a decade later, and never married again. A heavy smoker for most of her life, Culp was diagnosed with cancer of the larynx and died on the 3rd of February 1991 at a friend's home in Palm Desert, California, at 69. They buried her in a small churchyard in Mifflintown, Pennsylvania, near her grandfather and her great-grandparents, far from the studios that had employed her. Her headstone carries her naval rank, and beneath it, the name of the character she played for 9 seasons. She gave America a fussy fictional secretary and carried underneath a war record and a run for Congress. The stone in that churchyard names the woman and the role on one slab of granite, the truth and the costume side by side. The 3rd name on this roster learned to play criminals the hard way, by being one. Before any director ever cast Leo Gordon as a killer, he tried to rob a bar at gunpoint in Southern California and took a bullet in the stomach as the police closed in. Convicted of armed robbery, he served his time inside San Quentin, where he read his way through the prison library and began, quietly, to teach himself to write. In this picture, he was Cass Dowdy, the bounty hunter stalking Clint Walker, a rare match for Walker in size and threat. What the prison gave him, oddly, was a second trade. He came out, studied acting on the benefit owed to veterans, and met an actress named Lynn Cartwright at school. They married on Valentine's Day in 1950 and stayed together 50 years, raising a daughter whose godfather was the film star Tyrone Power. The menace was never an act, yet the man underneath was a writer Hollywood refused to picture. He sold scripts under the name Leo V. Gordon, handed a young Jack Nicholson an early role, and wrote close to 50 episodes apiece for the era's biggest westerns. Filming a scene with John Wayne, when Wayne complained that he had fallen wrong after being shot, Gordon lifted his shirt and showed him the real scar where a real bullet had gone in. A director who worked with him called him the scariest man he had ever met, and one of his prison films was shot inside the very walls where he had once been held. After a brief illness, he died of heart failure in his sleep at his Los Angeles home on the 26th of December, 2000, at 78. His ashes rest inside a columbarium at Hollywood Forever, set beside those of the wife he had married half a century earlier. He played outlaws because he had been one, and he wrote the words that made other men famous from a craft he picked up in a cell. Number 4 nearly ended in November of 1976, when a stroke struck Ellen Corby at the height of her fame. The warning sign was simple. She failed to arrive on set, and she was a woman who was never late. When a castmate raised the alarm, help reached her in time, and the production wrote the stroke directly into the story rather than write her out. She came back in 1978 with her speech only partly recovered and kept playing the part anyway. For this film, she was Hazel Squires, the woman who sells the Coles their livestock, warm and plain-spoken across a handful of scenes. Her road to the camera ran the long way around. Born in Wisconsin to Danish immigrants, she spent years behind the scenes as a script supervisor on silent-era comedy lots before she ever stepped in front of a lens, breaking in only through sheer stubbornness. Long before the grandmother role made her famous, she had earned an Academy Award nomination and won a Golden Globe for her work in the film I Remember Mama. She married a cinematographer 2 decades older than her in 1934, divorced him 10 years later, and had no children. Her steadiest companion in the years afterward was a friend who stayed at her side for 45 years. Corby died of natural causes on the 14th of April 1999 at the Motion Picture and Television Hospital in Woodland Hills, California, at 87. They laid her to rest at Forest Lawn in Glendale. She won 3 Emmys late in life as a grandmother to millions, and when a stroke tried to take the role from her, she simply refused to let go. 5th on the list spent his whole career as a second man, and the studio that employed him is said to have broken apart even his marriage as a piece of business. By several accounts, MGM engineered the divorce of Keenan Wynn's first wife and her remarriage to his close friend Van Johnson, and tied the renewal of his own contract to the arrangement. He was left billed forever as a supporting name, always listed with Ann and/or Ann also, never above the title. In this film, he was Jed Curry, the rancher scheming for Cole's land, a businessman villain who preferred money to violence. He had entered the trade as the only child of the comedian Ed Wynn, taking his stage name from a grandfather who had acted on Broadway. The father cast a long shadow, and the son once helped that father climb out of a breakdown and back into work. 4 marriages marked his life, and 2 of his sons became writers, one of them an Emmy winner. His later years were dogged by a savage ringing in his ears, a souvenir of a lifelong love of racing boats and cars, and he wore 2 hearing aids and kept working through it. Wynn died of pancreatic cancer at his Brentwood home on the 14th of October, 1986, at 70. After an 8-month fight, he hid from nearly everyone. Only his closest family knew he was ill, and they were with him when he went. They buried him at Forest Lawn in Glendale. He began as Ed Wynn's son and finished as one of the most reliable character actors of his time, the officer who shot a soda machine in Dr. Strangelove, a man who built a long career out of never once being the star. Halfway through our list comes a tragedy no script would dare invent. In October of 2019, Ron Ely's wife Valerie was stabbed to death at their home in Santa Barbara County, and their 30-year-old son, named as responsible, was shot and killed by sheriff's deputies who arrived at the scene. Ely was home through it. He and his 2 daughters later went to court, challenging the deputies' use of force as unjustified. Here he played Tad Curry, one of the land-grabbing rancher's sons, a hard and athletic young heavy. That athleticism would soon make him famous as television's Tarzan, a role on which he performed almost all of his own stunts and paid for it with 2 broken shoulders and more than a dozen other injuries, the lion bites among them. Beyond the Jungle, he hosted the Miss America pageant, carried the lead in a Doc Savage adventure on the big screen, and in later life turned to writing novels. He married a high school sweetheart young and divorced quickly. In 1984, he wed Valerie Lundeen, a former beauty queen he met while hosting a pageant. and together they raised 3 children before everything came apart. Ely died on the 29th of September 2024 at the home of one of his daughters in Los Alamos, California, at 86, his health failing after a diagnosis that affected the brain. Where his family laid him to rest has been kept private, the way they kept their grief private in the end. He was the most physically unbreakable figure on television in his prime, a man who shrugged off broken bones and the teeth of lions, and his life closed in a sorrow that no strength on earth could have held back. If one story in this film has stayed with you so far, leave it in the comments and tell me which name hit the hardest. I want to know who you are still thinking about tonight. Our 7th name kept the books in Hollywood before doctors warned that the work was endangering his good eye. Jack Elam had already lost the sight in his left eye as a boy, stabbed with a pencil during a scuffle at a scout meeting, and the damaged muscles slowly pulled the surviving eye into the wandering, wide stare that would make his face one of the most recognizable in Westerns. In this picture, he set the menace aside and played Hank, the gentle, odd handyman adopted by the family's little girl. How he reached the screen was a trade rather than a discovery. A director friend needed money for a film, and Elam, the numbers man, arranged the financing in exchange for a role, then never went back to accounting. The villain parts gave way to comedy as the years passed, from a fly trapped in a gun barrel in one classic Western to the broad clowning of the Cannonball Run pictures. Late in life, he formed a tender friendship with a boy who had a rare aging disease, the two of them close after working on a film together. He married young and lost his first wife to cancer in 1961, which left him with 2 daughters. 7 months later, he married again and stayed married 42 years, until the end. Elam died of congestive heart failure at his home in Ashland, Oregon on the 20th of October, 2003, a month shy of 83. He was cremated, and his ashes were given to his family, with no public marker left behind to visit. The dangerous eye that unsettled audiences for 50 years was the gift of a childhood accident, and the man behind it was a soft-spoken bookkeeper who once balanced the accounts of a major Hollywood mogul before the math nearly cost him his sight. Number 8 came home one day to find her house stripped bare. Every possession of Martha Hires had been carried off by thieves, a jolt to a life she admitted had tipped into reckless high living. She had married a famous producer whose tight grip on money, by her own account, left her to bankroll their lavish world, and the spending ran ahead of her. In this film, she was Angela Cole, the worried ranch wife, the rare prestige name in a modest family Western. She had come from real money in Fort Worth, the daughter of a judge, and she carried a drama degree and the polish of the old studio system. Her performance in Some Came Running had brought an Academy Award nomination, and she had shared the screen with John Wayne and Cary Grant. After she turned 40, the strong roles thinned, and she found herself shuffled into pictures she would later say she would rather forget. Her first marriage ended fast in divorce. The second, to the producer Hal Wallace, lasted 20 years until his death in 1986, and she had no children of her own. Hire died of natural causes at her home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, on the 31st of May 2014, at 89. There was no funeral and no memorial service. Her body was returned to California and placed in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn in Glendale. An Oscar nominee who had once dined at hotel openings across the world, she chose in the end to vanish into the desert on purpose, painting and hiking in deliberate silence, trading the fame she once chased for an anonymity she came to prize. Ninth comes a man who built a Grammy-winning band out of pure devotion to a dead genius. Med Flory transcribed Charlie Parker's saxophone solos note for Impossible Note and taught 9 musicians to play them in tight formation. The group was called Super Sax, and its first album won the Grammy, a strange triumph for a man most television viewers knew only as a Western heavy. In this film, he was Duke Squires, using his towering frame for one more rugged supporting turn between recording sessions. Music was the inheritance. His mother had played organ for silent films, and Flory carried a philosophy degree and a war record in the Army Air Forces before he ever found steady screen work. Long before that, he had toured with the big bands of Woody Herman and Claude Thornhill, and his hometown in Indiana later named a jazz festival in his honor. He married Joan Fry and stayed with her to the end, spending his last good years caring for her as Alzheimer's disease took hold, and he was tended in turn by his own son in his final illness. Flory died of a heart ailment at his home in North Hollywood on the 12th of March 2014 at 87. Where his family laid him afterward was kept quiet, marked only by a memorial at the Musicians' Union Hall he had belonged to. Here is the detail that stops the breath. He died on the 12th of March, the very date on the calendar that Charlie Parker had died, the man whose every solo Flory had spent his life resurrecting on stage. The student followed the master out the door, 59 years apart, on the same day. If these stories are landing with you, take a moment to subscribe because there are still more names and more resting places ahead in this one. 10th on this roster, trained as a singer, then lost the voice that was meant to be his whole career. His longest run came as a working character face rather than a star, dependable across some 200 films that included His Girl Friday and The Big Sleep, with a later television home on the crime series Burke's Law. The single moment that outlasted them all was no line of dialogue. In a 1941 picture, he and the actress Jane Wyman shared what was long called the longest kiss in Hollywood history, 3 minutes and 5 seconds of film. Toomey died of natural causes at the Motion Picture and Television Hospital in Woodland Hills, California, on the 12th of October 1991 at 93. Weeks before the end, 2 old friends came to see him at the hospital, Ronald and Nancy Reagan, the former First Lady, at the bedside of the man who had once kissed the president's first wife on screen for a record. Where he was laid to rest is not part of the public record. A trained singer silenced by illness, he made his name with no voice at all, remembered above every spoken line for one wordless kiss that ran past 3 minutes. The 11th name received the cruelest honor of all: a Walk of Fame. Star meant to crown Don Haggerty's career was carved with the wrong first name, the name of an unrelated actor, and the mistaken star was eventually pried up and removed, while the other man later received a correct one of his own. That lifetime of steady work was capped by a monument that did not even spell him right. In this film, he played Sam Potts, Cole's good-natured friend, killed early by the bear. He had been a star athlete at an Ivy League school and a serviceman before the cameras, a burly, granite-jawed presence who worked nearly every studio in town across war pictures and hard crime films. Tough detectives, mob killers, sheriffs, and cavalry officers filled his decades on screen. 3 marriages ran through his life, to 3 different women across the years. Haggerty died on the 19th of August, 1988, at 74, far from Hollywood, in Cocoa Beach, Florida. The specific cause was never made public, and neither was the place he was laid to rest. By a final twist, the stranger whose name had been carved over his own would become famous years later, playing a frontiersman and his pet grizzly bear. An odd echo for a man who met his own screen death in this very picture, beside a grizzly of his own. He spent a career as a dependable face in hundreds of films, and the single marker built to remember him bore a stranger's name before it was taken away entirely. His legacy erased by one misspelled word. Our final name wrote a letter straight to the head of Warner Brothers to seize one starring role. Sammy Jackson won the lead in a 1964 television comedy as a country boy in uniform, and for a moment the gamble looked like triumph. His very first taste of that role had been a single spoken line in the original 1958 film version, which only sharpened his hunger for the lead. The network then placed his show directly opposite the program, headlined by the very actor who had made that same role famous, and Jackson's series was buried in the ratings and gone within a single season. In this film, he was Cal Curry, another of the rancher's sons, all folksy country energy. The country boy parts came easily and then dried up just as fast. When Hollywood stopped calling, he reinvented himself behind a microphone, becoming a familiar country music voice on Los Angeles radio and cutting records of his own along the way. His personal life stayed largely out of the public record, kept to himself. Jackson died of heart failure in 1995 at just 57, the youngest of this cast to go. Where his family laid him afterward was never publicly recorded. A quiet close for a man who had once been bold enough to write the boss directly and ask for a part. He chased one shot at the spotlight with a handwritten letter and lost it to bad timing against a bigger star, then found a second life as a voice in the dark, talking country music to a city that had stopped casting him. They scattered far from that Wyoming ranch, to Glendale and Hollywood, a Pennsylvania churchyard, a Santa Fe desert, an Oregon home, a Florida shore the cameras never once visited.